Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today's going to be very different because I've never actually done this type of video before, and it's something that I really played with whether to do or not. So as you may have seen on my channel, I did recently just do my top reads of 2023. It's a really, really fun video for me to film every single year. Again, I've done it since the very beginning of my channel. But one of the things I always said I never wanted to do was I never wanted to do my worst reads of 2023 because I think it's very negative. I think some books work for some people, they don't work for other people, and there's a lot of different writing styles, a lot of different plot points that certain people gravitate towards that others don't. So while I do love doing reviews on my channel and to share my own personal thoughts on books, I don't ever want to have an entire video that's just labeled of these were the books that I did not like the most. Because I don't think that's fair. But what I do think is worth talking about are books that disappointed me and why. So I have here a stack of books that all range from 1 to 3 star reviews from me, and I want to talk about them and why they didn't necessarily work for me this year. Now again, that does not mean that they are all bad books. That does not mean that they are all books that I absolutely hated. They are just books that for one reason or another I had a lot of anticipation for and was really, really excited about and suspected that they could be 5-star reads for me, and they weren't. And I want to talk about why that didn't happen. And for the most part, they are all from authors that I have read before, with the exception of one. And we'll go into depth on that one book and why I wanted to talk about it, because it is a little bit different than the other books on this. And I will say again, there are many, many, many books this year that did not live up to the hype that was surrounding them, that I thought could be better, that I wasn't a fan of. I had way too many 2- and 3-star reviews, and I had my 1-star review this year. But I didn't want to just include books that I didn't like. I only want to talk about books that I was very excited for that did not end up being 4 or 5-star reads for me. And yeah, so I am not doing this in any like specific ranking order. I'm literally doing this chronologically from when I read them. So the first book of the year that did not live up to my expectations, unfortunately, was Echo by Thomas Hoyvelt. And this book is a huge disappointment to me because not only was it my most anticipated book of 2022, it was also my most anticipated book of 2021 because it was originally supposed to come out in 2021, and I'm not sure why, but it did get pushed back to 2022. I absolutely adored Thomas Hoyvelt's like debut American release, Hex. I think it was brilliant. It was one of my top books of 2020. So when I heard he was writing Echo, I was very, very excited about it. However, when I started reading it, I realized that this is very, very different from Hex in both tone and style. And I was very, very let down reading this. This book took me way too long to get through. It's not very long at all. It's just under 400 pages, and I think I spent like 2 or 3 weeks just slowly trekking along reading this book. And I'm still not even sure what happened. As far as I can tell, this is the story about a man who is very into mountain climbing who somehow or another gets possessed by the mountain and then has supernatural powers from the mountain that somehow relate to birds. And I think it's either his boyfriend or his fiance, like don't know how to cope with this, and then they take the possessed man back towards like the town at the base of the mountain. I'm sure there's some deep metaphor for everything in here, but it just didn't work for me. It was really hard for me to grasp this concept and the mythology around this mountain and what everything was. Again, I feel like there was also something maybe lost in translation. I know that Thomas Hoyvelt, he translated Hex from, I believe, Dutch to English, and he restructured the book, especially the ending, to read more towards an American audience. I do not believe that happened with this book. I'm not sure if he was the translator, but something tells me he was not. And I feel like there was just something very, very lost in translation in this book, and this was very difficult for me to get through. It was very confusing. I didn't like the lore. I didn't like the mythology. I'm not quite sure what the metaphor was. And this ended up being a 3-star read from me. There were some really interesting moments in the book, and I did kind of enjoy the setting, but everything else was pretty lost on me, and I just had such a hard time getting through this, and I was not a fan. And it was so disappointing because I read this in like February, right when it first came out, as like my most anticipated read for the year, and it just let me down almost immediately. Okay, next up. This is a similar situation with Echo. So this is the Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. This was another one of my most anticipated reads of 2022. This is another book that I knew it wasn't coming out until 2022, but I believe I learned about it at the end of 2020. And I was really, really excited because I had just read A Head Full of Ghosts. That was my first introduction to Paul Tremblay, and I was so thrilled with that book. I really do love and adore that book. And I loved the premise of this book. I thought this book was going to be all about these like two punk rock teenagers, one who may or may not be a vampire, like after school, I think it's in like the 80s, like in like this morbid funeral home club where they like are the pallbearers at random people's funeral. And I really thought it was going to be this like cool, gothy, coming of age, punk rock music romp in New England, because Paul Tremblay always has his books in New England. And this was just like a weird, like, autobiography veiled as like fiction about Paul Tremblay's like failed music career. I don't know. The Pallbearers Club, the fact that this is the title and the fact that the Pallbearers Club is literally like less than 10% of this book. Like, this book should be called Mercy's Edit, because it's literally just this girl who may or may not be a vampire writing edits on the biography of our main character's life, and neither of them are likable people. Art Barbara is like one of the most boring, one-dimensional characters I've read about in a very, very long time, and the fact that I'm supposed to think he's interesting when he's just kind of this like follower, and he's also kind of maybe crazy and superstitious, I just don't get it. This wasn't scary. This didn't feel like horror to me. Like, the shining moments of this book were the fact that there's a good chunk of it that takes place in Providence, Rhode Island, and I love Providence, Rhode Island, and I go there all the time. So I could like visualize where certain scenes were taking place, but oh my god, I don't know what this was, but this was not a horror novel, and it sure as hell is not about pallbearers. So this is not a book that was for me. I can appreciate some of the stylistic writing, and I feel like I probably should have given this a 2-star rating, but for some reason I gave it a 3-star rating after finishing it, and I guess I'm going to stick by that. But this was such a letdown, and just not at all about what I thought it was going to be. And remember, I got the UK version in a recent Abominable Book Club box, and I read the back of that and compared it to the inside flap of this one, and the UK version is way more targeted to what the story is actually about. This one really makes me think this is going to be like a coming-of-age story with like vampires and funerals, and it's just not. I guess in a way, it's like a coming-of-age story, but not in the traditional way that I needed it to be. This was just weird. It was like a very just like self-absorbed memoir. I couldn't with that one. Alright, next up. Next up is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. Now, I was super, super stoked to read this. And this, I believe, I think came in a Nightworms package. And when it showed up, I was stunned at how small it was, because I thought this was going to be like a full-length novel, and not like a 150-page novella. T. Kingfisher is an author I discovered, I think, back in early 2021. She takes short stories from famous, like, old-timey gothic lit authors and pretty much redoes them. She, like, does these stylized homages to them, and they're really, really cool. I really loved The Hollow Places, which was a spin on The Willows. I thought it was really, really cool, and I loved how it was so derived from the source material, but so vastly different than the story as a whole. I had so much fun with it. It had body horror, it had cosmic horror, it had claustrophobia and hidden spaces and talking, moving taxidermy. And it was awesome. It was so cool. And then I read The Twisted Ones, which was a spin on The White People by Arthur Machen. And I enjoyed that. I didn't love it anywhere near as much as The Hollow Places, but I really liked it. I really liked the the concept behind it, the kind of the formula that T. Kingfisher uses to write her stories. And the Twisted Ones actually came out before The Hollow Places, so it was cool that I liked her more recent novel more than her debut novel, or her debut novel under that name at least, because she's written under other names. T. Kingfisher's a pen name. So I was really stoked for What Moves the Dead, because this was going to be a story on Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. And that's a longer story, I believe, than The Willow, so I was really excited for like a full-length novel of her kind of modernized version of the Fall of the House of Usher. And what I got was an elongated, overly detailed reimagining of the Fall of the House of Usher, set at the same time with a lot of just strange additions to it. I'm really over this concept of mushrooms in horror. I'm just going to kind of leave it at that. I have another book I'm going to talk about shortly that also features evil mushrooms. I'm really over the feral fungus kind of thing. I don't like it. And I'm just done with it. I also just didn't love how for such a short book she tried to create an entirely new country in Europe, so that having a non-binary character who didn't identify with she or he pronouns could exist in the 1800s. And while I really commend T. Kingfisher for taking that approach, I think it would have been so much easier to just set this book in modern times and just say, hey, our main character's pronouns are they, them. Because there was so much detail that I felt was just so unnecessary just to explain that one character had they, them pronouns. And I understand that T. Kingfisher didn't set this story in the 1800s, but I feel like if it had been set in 2022, like, I still would have believed it. Like, just make it so their cell phones don't work. You know, make the Wi-Fi bad. And, like, a lot of what happened in the story could still be set there. And I think it would have been so much cooler to see a modern retelling of this story than to have what they put on display instead. You know, like, there's a whole thing about wanting to have a private doctor, a doctor they trust. We could totally do that in today's times, you know? And I just feel like T. Kingfisher really did herself a disadvantage by setting it in the 1800s and then having to add all of these extra excessive details to an already super short story that wasn't needed if she just changed the time. And it just felt like it dragged on to force a narrative that I didn't care about reading, because at the end of the day, she didn't do much to modernize the Fall of the House of Usher. She just added some extra characters in there and changed the root cause of Madeline Usher's ailment, and it was just a crappier version of the Fall of the House of Usher. It had none of the fun, whimsical, contemporary, modernized reimaginings that I love from T. Kingfisher, and I was so disappointed to see her do that with Poe. It was like she was scared to move from the source material, and my thing that I love about her is how much she deviates from the source material to make such a new, contemporary feeling version of that story. So that was a huge letdown for me. But luckily it was short. Luckily it was short. The other ones I'm going to talk about are not short. Okay. I feel like almost all of these but one are going to be 3-star reads, just because at least there was some merit to it. So my next biggest disappointment was Clown in a Cornfield 2, Friendo Lives by Adam Sassari. Now, one of the reasons this is such a huge disappointment for me is because Clown in a Cornfield 1 was my top read of 2020. I read the whole thing in like 2 days. Literally, I think if I didn't have to have gone to work, I would have read the whole thing in one sitting. I loved Clown in a Cornfield. It was a B-movie slasher in a novel. It was campy, it was cheesy, it had annoying kids, it had like it was like a bloodbath in a cornfield with clowns. Like, it was just awesome. It read like such an 80s movie, even though they're set in modern times, and I was so excited for this because I thought this was going to be the same thing. However, instead, this doesn't feel like a B-movie slasher at all. This seems like a retelling of the January 6th storming of the Capitol and all of the other weird political things that have happened over the last 2 years, and Adam Sassari's full commentary on it through unlikable main characters, unrealistic situations, and basically replacing MAGA hats with clown hats. it just felt like a regurgitation of everything that I see on the news. There was nothing original in this. All of the characters were unlikable, pretty much for the most part. There was one minor character who had appeared in Clown in a Cornfield 1, who becomes more of a major character in this, and she was the only character I was really interested in reading. The whole slasher concept of this book was kind of thrown out the window because any character with any kind of plot armor lives, which I was really bummed about because in the original that's not the case, and in pretty much every slasher that's not the case. Like, there's always a final girl usually, but in this story it was like, who cares? You know, it was just side characters left and right that were being sacrificed to the clowns, and I just didn't vibe with this. This just was so overtly political, and I just didn't want that in this book. I don't want overt political commentary in a book that I expect to be a B-movie, cheesy, campy slasher with primarily teenage characters. And I was just stunned when I read this, and just the tone and the writing style was just so much heavier and so poignant to get certain points across. Unlike the other one, which has a little bit of like, like social commentary from Adam Cesare, but like, it's not egregious. It's not being shoved down my throat. It doesn't take over the story. It doesn't overshadow the slasher of it all. And this book was just so overshadowed by Adam Cesare's personal political beliefs, that it just fully took away from like a fun story. And this has absolutely nothing to do with what he believes, but when I'm reading a fun, cheesy slasher, I'm not reading to be reminded of what's happening in the real world. I'm reading for escapism, and to just read a regurgitation of what I see on the news every single day is not relaxing. And I do a lot of this, even though it's hard, for self-care, and that was just not what I needed. So I was really, really bummed with that. All right, next up. Ghost Eaters by Clay McLeod Chapman. I love this cover. I will say this over and over and over again. I adore this cover. I was really stoked to read this book because I really enjoyed Whisper Down the Lane. I liked Clay McLeod Chapman's writing style. I believe that was a 4-star read for me. It kept me engaged. It wasn't the greatest thing I've ever read, but I really had fun with it. And when I read the premise of this, I thought this was going to be really, really cool. So the premise of this book is, what if there was a drug that you could take that would allow you to communicate with your dead loved ones? Very, very interesting. The problem with this book is that this pretty much became a very, very, very heavy metaphor for addiction. Which I kind of wish I knew going into it, because I feel like if it had been promoted that way, I might have had a more open mindset to what this was. I thought this was going to be more cool, ghost hunty, like horror fun, and this was a very serious novel. Unfortunately, though, not only is it very serious, it has absolutely zero likable characters. This was so hard for me to read because literally every single main character, every single side character is self-absorbed, greedy, rude, self-centered, would drop their friends in a heartbeat, would endanger their friends in a heartbeat, do not care about their loved ones, do not care about their families, do not care about their friends or concerns or people who try to help them. Not a single person, not any of our 4 main characters, not our central characters' parents, like pretty much anybody interacting within this story with one another is a very self-centered person. And I had a really, really difficult time with that because none of the characters were likable, so I didn't care about what happened to them. There was no sympathy. They were just flawed and awful to one another, and everything they did was just so tragic, except I didn't care because they just treated everybody so terribly. It's one thing to make a tragic figure who has tried to overcome certain things, but our main character is not only addicted to substances, several different substances, she's also addicted to a very abusive, manipulative man. And I thought this book ended on a very unfeministic tone. I get the point that it was trying to make, but to me, it was just so bleak and sad and sent the wrong message to female readers in my mind that I just didn't vibe with it at all. I really, really despised the ending of this novel. I thought it was literally the last page that just like stuck with me, and not in a good way. It's not like it haunted me. It was just like, I could tell that this book was written by a man by how the book was ended. And again, a very bleak outlook on the willpower of women, and I hated that. The other thing I hated about this book is, why are mushrooms evil? Why is this a thing? I can't with the evil mushrooms. I really can't. This is the third book I've read in the last year and a half that was like highly anticipated read that talks about evil fucking mushrooms. Mushrooms do not scare me, okay? And it's just like this thing, and they just keep pushing it, and in so many books, and it's like, like spores. I can see spores being scary. Mushrooms do not scare me. I'm gonna go and get a hot pot tonight, a dry hot pot tonight, and I'm going to eat like 4 different types of mushrooms. Mushrooms do not scare me, and I'm so over it. But on top of unlikable characters and unlikable tones, and like unfeministic tones, we also have evil mushrooms, and I just couldn't. I couldn't. I'm done with the evil mushrooms, y'all. If there's any books on my most anticipated reads of 2023 and any of them deal with evil mushrooms and you know about it, tell me, because I don't want to read it. I can't do the evil mushrooms. Whew. Okay, one more book, guys. And I mentioned this in my December wrap-up, and I want to talk about this a little bit more. So my last biggest disappointing read of the year is River of Ashes. Now, I wanted to put this book on for 2 reasons. One, because it was my only 1-star read of the entire year. It's very, very, very difficult to get a 1-star rating from me, and that pretty much only happens if it's a book I am forced to read. The book is so short that I feel like I have to finish it just because I feel like I have to finish it so I can give it a chance. Or in this case, this book was like not great, and then hit the full 1-star rating at the very, very end. Like, I'm not gonna DNF a book when I've read 90% of it. I'm gonna finish it. And the other reason this is on this list is because this was the inaugural book for the Twisted Retreat subscription box. For those of you guys who do not know, Twisted Retreat is a horror monthly subscription book box done by the people over at Unplugged Book Box, which is one of my favorite subscription boxes. It pairs books and self-care. And Twisted Retreat is more like horror-focused fandoms with like really cool, beautiful horror editions of new releases, and like sort of has self-care items. It's not a fully focused self-care box, but I do like how they throw in some self-care items. And this was the inaugural book that was included. I said this in my December wrap-up and my unboxing. This is an absolutely stunning book. This is an exclusive edition of this book for Twisted Retreat. And I was so excited to read this book because I really wanted to see what type of tone Twisted Retreat was going to have as a horror box. I know Unplugged tends to be a little more on like the cozy comfort side. A lot of times I get fantasy and romance books that I wouldn't normally read. And when I do get darker toned books, they tend to be on the lighter side of horror. They're never really as heavy as some of the stuff that I would generally read or gravitate towards. So I was really interested to see what type of tone we would get from Twisted Retreat. I am happy to say that they really went full brutal with their first book. I just wish it was a full brutal style in a way that would have worked for me. So I don't think Twisted Retreat will be shying away from any type of dark, twisted themes over the next coming months. But this book was just not it for me. And there are 2 major issues that I had with the book. The first and foremost being the writing. I did not like the writing. I did not like the character development. I did not like the pacing, the stylization. I just didn't think that these 2 authors, Alexandria Weiss and Lucas Astor, knew necessarily what they were doing. Our characters are all one note. They start one way. There is no progression or growth at all with any of them, and they end the same way. They are all very stereotypical, very cliche high school students who fall into generic categories. We have like the popular cheerleader. We have the football bully. We have the like cool girl and her perfect boyfriend. They all fall into these like just very, very underwhelming cliches. There's nothing intriguing about any of the main characters, including our psychopath. Because from the very beginning, we are told he is crazy, he is evil, but nobody suspects that he is crazy or evil because he has everybody wrapped around his finger. And then you read an entire book in which everybody sees through this person and sees just how horrible they are. And then the thing that makes this book even worse is the depravity and brutality that is then depicted in this novel. This book very, very, very much wants to be an American Psycho style book. The level of violence to women is definitely there. Yet it was readable for the first couple hundred pages. It was definitely readable for at least the first like 200 pages because it's kind of all off screen. Like, it happens and you know it happens, but it's not really that graphic and it's not really that detailed or that brutal. The concepts and scenarios are definitely off-putting, but it was readable. I could read what was going on. And then we get to like the big climax of this novel where all of a sudden it just goes from kind of being vague about what our main character Beau Devereaux is doing to women and then explains it in explicit graphic detail. And I couldn't stomach that because it was just so out of left field to have such a CW style like Gossip Girl, Riverdale story, and then to have just this horrific moment of absolute true violence, I thought was awful. And then once we get past all of that, the overall message of this book is like, don't come forward about your abuser, get even with them. And I was just like, I'm sorry, what? Like, for young girls who are reading this, like high school age girls, I would be terrified that they would read this and go, oh, I shouldn't go forward with anything if something bad happens to me, to the police or to teachers or to authority. I should take matters into my own hand because that's what this book says to do and that's effective for these women. And it was just like, oh no, 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 no. And the other thing that bothered me is all of the girls who are like targeted or punished by Beau Devereaux in this book, for the most part, tend to be women who are a little more promiscuous. And I feel like that's the wrong word because it's just a woman being female, you know? But they are portrayed as having these kind of promiscuous tendencies and therefore they are punished in the book. And I thought that was a horrible, horrible message to send to people because it's like, you know what? Sex isn't bad. I just kind of hated like the moral undertones that came through this book and how like these women were depicted as immoral. Like one is into like BDSM and she's depicted so horribly for that, and it just bothered me because it's like, why is that bad? And then at the end of the book the author talks all about how she wanted to write like a very feminist story and like encourage women to know like they can speak up and they're not alone. But it's like, your book didn't say that at all. Your book did the exact opposite. And I was just very offended by this. And the only really good thing that I got out of this book is knowing that at least Twisted Retreat will be doing books that truly span different levels of horror and aren't just going to be kind of on the safe side like they are with Unplugged. But this was a huge disappointment to me, and it's a bummer, especially because this is such a beautiful, beautiful edition. But I really hated this book, and I didn't like its tone towards women. I didn't like its writing. I didn't like its character development. I didn't like its plot. And it was just bad. And I hate saying that a book is bad, but like, guys, this book was bad. And it was very disappointing, and I feel like icky that I read it, but that is that. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. As always, I post every Monday and Thursday, sometimes on Saturdays. And if you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah!